What would you do if you were born so rich that money seemed to bend the world around you, and yet you were still told, politely of course, in that gilded sort of way, that none of it was enough? What would you do if every glance reminded you that as a woman, your inheritance wasn't yours to keep, but a prize to be won, bargained over, and eventually spent by someone else? Imagine walking into every ballroom, every drawing room, every whispered corridor of high society, knowing the chandeliers sparkled for your fortune, the bows bent to your father's money, and the smiles curved not toward you, but toward the figure stamped across your name. That was the fate of Anna Gould, daughter of Jay Gould, Wall Street's most ruthless railroad baron. She was an heiress with more wealth than some kingdoms, but no amount of silks or Parisian palaces could erase the fact that society thought her money came from the wrong kind of power, and that she came from the wrong kind of family. She could buy diamonds the size of your knuckle, she could dine with dukes and emperors, but she could never quite buy the respect she wanted most. And so, she lived a life of contradiction, worshipped for her wealth, mocked for her lineage, and forever haunted by the question of whether she was loved for herself or simply for the fortune that trailed her like a shadow. So tonight, let's follow her story. Because if you've ever felt like people loved what you had, but not who you were, you may find you understand Anna more than you'd think. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. This is your time to rest, your time to drift. So let this story carry you slowly through scandal, splendor, and the sharp edge of loneliness that even diamonds can't dull. And if you're still awake when the tale is done, I'll be here, waiting to say goodnight. Anna Gould entered the world in 1875, the youngest daughter of Jay Gould, the man who was, depending on who you asked, either a genius of finance or a walking moral catastrophe. You know how today, when someone's dad happens to own a mega tech company, they can't post a single selfie without half the internet commenting, "Yeah, but it's daddy's money." Well, Anna was living that reality 150 years ago, before Instagram, before comment sections, and before the term Nepo baby existed. But make no mistake, she was the turn-of-the-century version of one. Her father, Jay Gould, was one of the most infamous robber barons of America's Gilded Age. This was a man who practically weaponized the stock market, manipulating railroads, gold prices, and public opinion with a level of shamelessness that would make even the greediest hedge fund manager today blush. He was worth hundreds of millions when most people were lucky to have shoes without holes in them. Newspapers called him everything from the Mephistopheles of Wall Street to the most hated man in America. Imagine being 8 years old at school and realizing your father's reputation is basically the 19th century equivalent of being called the villain of capitalism on every headline. That was Anna's childhood. Now the Gould children, there were 6 of them, grew up in lavish comfort. Yes, but with a catch. Because in society's eyes, they weren't just rich, they were the wrong kind of rich. Their fortune came from bloodless speculation, not from generations of landed estates or heroic wars. And in that era, lineage mattered. A Vanderbilt or an Astor might be grudgingly accepted at a Newport ball, but the Goulds, they were seen as nouveau riche, the financial equivalent of showing up to the Met Gala in a knockoff gown. Anna especially bore the brunt of this. She was shy, quiet, and not what society magazines of the day would call a great beauty. While other heiresses were described with breathless language like the diamond of the season or the rose of Fifth Avenue, Anna's press clipping were far less generous. At best, she was plain, at worst, unglamorous. And in an era when a woman's face was considered part of her dowry, this was no small thing. You can almost picture the hushed drawing room conversations. She has millions, yes, but her nose, her fortune might be dazzling, but her family, and of course, the most cutting one. Would you really want to explain to your great-grandchildren that their grandmother was a Gould? So here was Anna, fabulously wealthy, yet still somehow untouchable in the marriage market. She had everything money could buy: jewels, Paris gowns, houses along Fifth Avenue, except the one thing her society demanded she secure: a title. In many ways, her situation is oddly relatable. Haven't we all known someone who seemed to have everything, yet couldn't quite fit into the group that mattered most to them? Today, it's the kid who owns the best sneakers, but still doesn't get invited to sit at the cool table. For Anna, the cool table was the aristocracy of Europe, and they wanted nothing to do with her, unless, of course, they could marry her fortune. Growing up in the shadow of this contradiction did something to Anna. She developed an odd mix of insecurity and stubbornness. She knew she wasn't admired for her beauty or her lineage. She knew the whispers followed her into every room. But she also knew she had what they wanted: money. And in a way, that gave her a kind of quiet power, even if it was laced with resentment. But before she could deploy that power, she had to survive the fishbowl of her youth. Imagine being a teenager whose father was constantly in the headlines, not for philanthropy or good deeds, but for financial trickery and cutthroat deals. When Gould died in 1892, Anna was just 17, and he left behind a fortune of nearly $80 million. That's billions in today's money. On paper, she was one of the richest young women in the world. In reality, she was the heiress no one wanted. This paradox played out most cruelly in her social life. Other wealthy girls her age were being courted at balls and country weekends. Anna, meanwhile, found herself enduring the awkward silence of being overlooked, except by those who were very obviously after her fortune. And here's where the dry humor writes itself. If Tinder had existed in the 1890s, Anna's profile would have been an absolute minefield. Swipe right, and you're not just getting Anna, you're auditioning for a railroad fortune. Swipe left, and you've just lost the chance to secure an estate, a yacht, and the kind of diamonds that required a footman just to carry the box. But where was the loves me for option? Non-existent. It's easy to feel sympathy. Think about the modern obsession with authenticity. Be yourself. Find someone who sees the real you. For Anna, that ideal was almost laughable. Her reality was, be rich, endure the mockery, and hope someone respectable enough will decide they can live with your last name if the checkbook is large enough. And yet, she wasn't entirely powerless. Gould may have left her with a tarnished family name, but he also left her with a kind of insulation. Money gave her choices that most women of her time could only dream of. She could travel, she could buy her way into European circles, if not into their hearts, and she could, as she grew older, attempt to carve her own path. But as a teenager, that path was murky at best. The newspapers loved to speculate about her future. Who would marry the quiet Gould daughter? Would it be a French duke, an English earl? Or would she be left to wither among her jewels, a modern Midas with no one willing to touch her gold? These weren't just idle questions. They were society's way of reminding Anna that her fate wasn't in her own hands. And so, as Anna Gould came of age in the 1890s, she carried a peculiar burden. She was dazzlingly rich, but socially suspect. She was American, which already made her new money in European eyes. And she was a Gould, which made her the lowest rung of even that ladder. To put it in modern terms, it was like having a black card, a private jet, and 10 million Instagram followers, but discovering that the A-list party you wanted to attend had quietly added your name to the do not admit list. That was the strange, frustrating beginning of Anna's life. The heiress who had everything except the one thing society demanded: acceptance. And so the stage was set for her to make choices, some bold, some reckless, and some that would cement her place in history, not as the heiress adored, but as the heiress underestimated. Imagine packing your trunks, not one, not two, but an entire fleet of them, each stuffed with gowns so heavily beaded and embroidered that if you dropped one overboard, it might sink a ship. Imagine doing this not because you're moving abroad permanently, but because you're crossing the Atlantic like a debutante storming a battlefield, ready to find yourself a husband. This was the reality for Anna Gould and dozens of other American heiresses at the end of the 19th century. Because here's the problem with being new money in New York. No one who had old money wanted anything to do with you. The Astors, the Livingstons, the Schuylers, the grand dusty families whose wealth went back to the Dutch fur traders, looked at people like the Goulds and saw little more than a tacky fortune built on railroads, speculation, and bad manners. They had the money, yes, but not the polish. They weren't the type you invited to your intimate Newport clambake, let alone let marry into your family. So if New York's old guard wouldn't give them the time of day, where did the daughters of American robber barons turn? Europe. It was a system so well oiled, it might as well have been an international trade route. Dollars for titles. Heiresses went husband shopping in Paris and London, their fathers wiring fortunes across the ocean in exchange for their daughters' marriages to dukes, counts, and viscounts who hadn't seen a solvent bank account in generations. And the humor in all this? It was essentially the 19th century version of Tinder. Swipe right if you have a crumbling chateau. Swipe left if you only own a townhouse in a fashionable arrondissement. The bios practically wrote themselves. Broke nobleman, 29, owns 3 castles, 2 of which are uninhabitable, seeking heiress with generous dowry to keep roofs from collapsing. Count, 33, family name older than the Pope, will marry for love of your million. Anna, when she arrived in Paris, was seen as a peculiar bargain. On one hand, she was embarrassingly rich. Her father's fortune ran into the hundreds of millions in today's dollars. On the other, she was hopelessly American. She didn't have the mannerisms, the accent, or the effortless sophistication the French elite demanded. Paris high society whispered about her the way teenagers whisper about a transfer student. Too much money, not enough class. Her laugh was too loud. Her French was too accented. Her taste in gowns leaned toward the ostentatious, the sort of fashion that screamed money rather than whispered refinement. But if the duchesses rolled their eyes, the bachelors, particularly the broke one, did not. For them, Anna wasn't gauche. She was a salvation. And so, the very thing that made her a punchline at the opera, her American new money bluntness, her clumsy attempts to charm the salon, made her magnetic to an entire generation of impoverished French aristocrats desperate to turn their coats of arms into cash. Anna was mocked in drawing rooms but courted on carriages. She was snubbed at luncheons but showered with roses by men whose families hadn't paid their wine merchants in decades. It was a strange double life, derided for her lack of grace by women and adored for her fortune by men. And somewhere in that mix of sneers and serenades, one man in particular stepped forward, a man with a dazzling name, the kind of cheekbones that looked good under candlelight, and, perhaps most importantly, debts so catastrophic that only an American fortune could save him. Count Boni de Castellane. Anna Gould's arrival in Paris society had barely cooled before she made her first spectacular gamble, marrying Count Boni de Castellane. And here is where the story starts to feel less like history and more like a very long, very expensive episode of Real Housewives of the Belle Époque. Boni was exactly what the brochures promised. He was tall, dashing, aristocratic, descended from one of the oldest noble families in France. His great-grandparents had been at Versailles when Marie Antoinette still had her. He could drop names like other men dropped cigar ash, casually, everywhere, and with the smugness of someone who had literally been born into a surname you'd need 3 breaths. There was, however, one tiny problem. Boni's family had prestige, but not a centime to its name. By the 1890s, the Castellanes were drowning in debt, kept afloat only by their ability to marry rich American women willing to trade dollars for dukedoms. In other words, Boni was the aristocratic equivalent of a modern man whose Tinder bio says, owns a mansion, currently bankrupt, looking for love, and a sponsor. Anna, with her iron vault of Gould money, was perfect. She was plain, yes. Socially awkward, certainly, but she was rich. Eye-wateringly, skyscraper-buildingly rich. And if Boni had to flatter her about her charming simplicity or her quiet grace, he would do it with a smile and a bow that had been practiced in the mirror since childhood. The match was made. In 1895, Anna Gould, daughter of J. Gould, the most despised railroad baron in America, married Count Boni de Castellane in a ceremony that glittered brighter than the chandeliers above it. The newspapers lapped it up. Another American heiress buying herself into the European aristocracy. One writer compared it to the Louisiana Purchase, except this time, France was selling the title, and America was footing the bill, and the bills began rolling in almost immediately. Boni did not believe in moderation. Why should he? He had married into a fortune designed for excess. Paris was in the middle of its Gilded Age, a city of electric lights, champagne fountains, and carriages that cost more than country estates. And Boni was determined that his wife, plain little Anna, would not just participate in this world, she would dominate it. He set his sights on building what can only be described as the most flamboyant marital flex in European history, the Palais Rose. Inspired by the Grand Trianon at Versailles, it was an enormous candy-colored pink palace, dripping in marble, gilding, and frescoes that made even the Louvre look restrained. Every ceiling was painted, every wall was covered in silk. Even the bathrooms gleamed with onyx and gold fixtures, the kind of place where you wouldn't be surprised if the toilet paper was monogrammed. And here's the kicker, all of it was funded by Anna. Her money poured into the palace like champagne into a fountain. She wrote checks. He spent them. She signed documents. He redesigned the dining hall. It was, in essence, the Gilded Age version of a joint bank account where one partner is building Versailles while the other partner is just trying to cover groceries. Society called it le mariage d'or, the marriage of gold. And it was. For Boni, for Anna, it was a marriage of hemorrhaging. Her fortune, once towering, began to shrink under the weight of fountains, statues, and banquets so large that entire kitchens had to be remodeled just to feed the guests. But here's the cruel irony. The more money she spent, the more Parisian society began to accept her. In New York, old money sneered at the Goulds. But in Paris, the fact that Anna could underwrite her husband's delusions of grandeur made her interesting. She was no longer just that awkward American. She was Madame la Comtesse, mistress of the Palais Rose, hostess of gala, where even dukes begged for invitations. It was intoxicating, at least at first. After all, who among us hasn't secretly fantasized about walking into a ballroom and having everyone whisper your name? Except, of course, in Anna's case, they weren't whispering, "Oh, how stunning." They were whispering, "Ah yes, the American ATM has arrived." Behind the curtains, though, the cracks were already forming. Boni's charm was surface level, his loyalty as shallow as a champagne saucer. He spent not just money, but affection freely, on mistresses, on flattery, on himself. Anna, meanwhile, was expected to smile, to bankroll, and to endure. And yet, here's the uncomfortable truth. She stayed, for years, perhaps out of hope, perhaps out of fear of scandal, or perhaps because when you've been told your entire life that your worth is your wealth, it's hard to walk away from the man who spends it so dazzlingly. So, Anna kept writing checks, Boni kept building, and the palace kept growing, room by gilded room, like a monument to the spectacular risk of marrying for a title. It all fell apart, of course, because if you pour millions of dollars into gilded staircases and endless parties, what you don't usually end up with is a stable, loving marriage. What you end up with is debt, resentment, and a very public shouting match in the middle of Paris high society. And for Anna Gould and Count Boni de Castellane, that shouting match eventually became something far bigger. A divorce case that shocked not just Paris, not just France, but the entire transatlantic social world. Now, here's the context you need. In Catholic France at the turn of the 20th century, divorce wasn't exactly a casual option. It wasn't like today, where you can unfollow your spouse on Instagram, quietly separate bank accounts, and let your lawyer send an email. No, divorce in Paris was scandalous, rare, and almost sacrilegious. When Anna and Boni went through it, the city reacted as if Notre Dame itself had cracked in two and fallen into the Seine. The newspapers couldn't get enough of it. Suddenly, the American heiress, who had once been dismissed as gauche, provincial, and hopelessly unfashionable, was now the star of the biggest gossip trial of the decade. And the Count? He was cast as the charming but rotten playboy who had squandered not only his wife's dowry, but also his family's remaining dignity. The accusations flew like champagne corks. Infidelity, because no good society scandal is complete without whispered affairs. Financial mismanagement, because Boni's spending habits had gone from eccentric to catastrophic. And, perhaps most humiliating of all, the very public admission that this so-called fairy tale marriage had in fact been nothing more than a business deal gone sour. Think of it as the Gilded Age equivalent of a celebrity breakup trending on Twitter. Every headline was a new revelation. Every dinner party in Paris buzzed with speculation. Who cheated first? How much money had vanished into that Versailles-sized palace? Who would walk away with what? The whole city leaned in as if watching a modern reality show. And Anna, she did something that shocked even her critics. She fought. She didn't shrink away in shame. She didn't crawl back to New York with her tail between her legs. She stood in the courts of France, a foreigner, a woman, an American at that, and demanded her rights. And against all odds, she won. It was humiliating for Boni. Not only was he branded a failure as a husband, but he was also left with the bitter truth that his glamorous lifestyle had been bankrolled entirely by the woman he had so often mocked. He, the noble count with generations of aristocratic blood, had been living off a Gould heiress from upstate New York, and in the end, she had the last word. The divorce papers were signed in 1906, and Paris society nearly fainted. The idea that a woman, and worse, an American woman, could defy tradition, humiliate her husband, and walk away with her fortune intact was more shocking than any of the lurid details. It wasn't just a broken marriage, it was a cultural earthquake. And yet, the irony remained. Anna had won her freedom, yes, but she had also cemented her reputation as the perpetual outsider, too rich for sympathy, too foreign for acceptance, too stubborn for forgiveness. She had bought a palace, funded an entire lifestyle, and endured humiliation in public, and still, society looked at her and saw a punchline. Because that was the paradox of the Gilded Age heiress. Money gave them power, but not respect. Wealth bought them castles, but not belonging. And no matter how loudly they fought, the caricatures in the press always seemed to win. After the dust settled from her very public split with Count Boni, and after the newspapers had wrung every last drop of ink from the scandal, Anna Gould did what any heiress with money, resilience, and a stubborn refusal to be beaten by French society would do. She married again. This time, her choice was Élie de Talleyrand-Périgord, the Duc de Sagan. Yes, that Talleyrand. If the name rings a bell, it should. The family line stretched back to Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord, Napoleon's famously slippery foreign minister, a man who was, at various points in his life, a bishop, a revolutionary, a traitor, a loyalist, a negotiator, and, above all, a survivor. If France has ever produced a political chameleon, it was him. So, when Anna married into the family, she wasn't just tying herself to another titled aristocrat. She was attaching her name to a legacy of scheming, diplomacy, and a knack for always landing on the winning side, no matter how chaotic the time. To American newspapers, this second marriage looked like vindication. Heiress redeems herself, one headline practically sang, as if Anna were a racehorse who had stumbled once but returned to form. Count Boni was yesterday's mistake. The Duc de Sagan was today's promise. The Talleyrand's were, after all, one of the most storied families in Europe. Never mind that their fortune, like so many aristocratic fortune, had dwindled. The title was still there, the palaces were still there, and the illusion of grandeur was still there, which frankly was all society ever wanted. Of course, the reality of life with Haley was not nearly so clean. For one thing, he came with his own baggage, rumors of affairs, whispers of gambling, and most importantly, a streak of pride that clashed magnificently with Count Boni's lingering obsession. Because yes, Boni was not done. He continued to hover on the edges of Anna's life like a bad Instagram ex who still likes every post but leaves snide comments. The gossip columns of Paris had a field day. Suddenly, Anna was no longer just a rich American heiress. She was the gravitational center of a French melodrama. Old money dukes, spurned counts, whispered mistresses, duels on the horizon. It was as if the entire city had agreed that Anna Gould was no longer a person, but a character in a serialized novel that needed a new scandal every month to keep the readership hooked. And here's where we pause to admire the sheer absurdity of it all. This wasn't the Middle Ages, where duels were fought with swords and ended in someone actually dying. This was the 1900s. France had railroads, telegraphs, even the beginnings of automobiles. And yet, two grown men were about to start planning to shoot each other over a woman's honor, as if they were starring in some Renaissance fair gone wrong. Anna, for her part, didn't exactly encourage the circus, but she couldn't stop it either. Because once you became the heiress whose husbands were willing to duel for her, you weren't seen as a person anymore. You were a myth, a symbol of dangerous feminine power, a femme fatale draped not in silks, but in dollar bills. And if you think the papers were going to miss their chance to paint her as the villainess in all this, well, you haven't met the Paris press of the Belle Époque. So here we are in 1908, Paris, a city that prided itself on being the cultural and intellectual capital of Europe, home to Rodin, Debussy, the Moulin Rouge, and the Eiffel. And yet, in this enlightened modern metropolis, two men in expensive suits were preparing to settle their differences with pistols at dawn. The men, Count Boni de Castellane, Anna Gould's first husband, and Haley de Talleyrand Périgord, Anna's second. Yes, really, her ex, her current. If this sounds like the premise for a very bad reality show, that's because it basically was. Imagine The Bachelor, but with dueling pistols. Now, to be clear, this wasn't even about Anna anymore, not directly. By 1908, she had moved on, remarried, and was trying, in her own way, to exist with some semblance of dignity. But Boni could not let go. He had squandered her money, lost her fortune, and been humiliated in the divorce. And then she had the audacity to remarry into an even grander family. That was too much for Boni's ego. So, like any man with too much pride and not enough sense, he challenged her new husband to a duel. The supposed reason, some insult, some remark, some matter of honor. The real reason? Pure, unfiltered spite. The Parisian press went wild. A duel between a count and a duke over an American heiress. It was everything the papers could have dreamed of. Scandal, romance, money, and the faint whiff of blood. People followed the story the way we follow celebrity meltdowns on social media today, refreshing the papers for updates, as if waiting for the next tweet in a flame war. The duel itself, of course, was anticlimactic, as duels in the 20th century tended to be. Both men showed up, both looked dramatic, both fired, and both missed, or depending on which report you. Perhaps neither really aimed to hit, because at the end of the day, nobody actually wanted to die for this. What they wanted was the spectacle, the headline, the proof that their pride was intact, and the press delivered. The duel made front-page news not only in Paris but across the Atlantic, where American readers consumed the story with equal parts horror and glee. Heiress Anna Gould, the girl mocked for her bad French and worse posture, had now inspired two noblemen to stand in a field with pistols like something out of a Dumas novel. For Anna, it was exhausting. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't wanted her life to be turned into a serialized melodrama, but that was the price of marrying into Europe's crumbling aristocracy. You became part of their performance, whether you liked it or not. And here's the irony. If Anna had been born a century later, she probably would have had a publicist, a lawyer, and a Netflix deal to spin this into a sympathetic miniseries. Instead, she had gossip columns, cartoons in the press, and endless whispers at salons. She wasn't a woman. She was content. The duel changed nothing, of course. Boni remained bitter and broke. Ailey remained proud and titled. And Anna remained stuck in the middle, her fortune still the magnet that drew everyone close, even as it dragged her reputation through the mud. But Paris society was thrilled, because nothing, absolutely nothing, entertained them more than the idea of nobles making fools of themselves, preferably at dawn, with pistols in hand. By the time the dust of the duels, divorces, and endless scandals had settled, Anna Gould had done something rather shocking. She endured. Not gloriously, not in the kind of triumphant way novels like to portray, but in the quieter, stubborn way that some women survive chaos simply by outlasting it. Yes, she remarried. Yes, she weathered humiliations. But what's most interesting is not the drama of her youth, but the long shadow of her later years. Decades that stretched far beyond what the Paris papers had once breathlessly chronicled. She and Gilded de Talleyrand Périgord, her second husband, did in fact have children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. And in that, she accomplished something Boni never could. She gave the aristocracy what it valued most, heirs and continuations. Ironically, the American heiress mocked for being gauche had now cemented herself into one of the oldest noble lineages in Europe. Her children bore names tied to centuries of French power, and whatever whispers society once tossed her way, those whispers now had to reckon with the fact that her bloodline, or at least her money, was entwined with their own. But motherhood didn't erase her other roles. Anna was never particularly known for her wit, her beauty, or her taste. Things Paris society pretended to value. What she did have was money and endurance, and over time, she redirected some of that toward philanthropy. It wasn't unusual for women of her standing to fund hospitals, schools, or Catholic charities, and Anna followed that pattern. Unlike her flamboyant sister Consuelo, who dominated headlines as the Duchess of Marlborough, Anna's gestures were quieter, often local, sometimes cloaked in anonymity. The irony is that she may have done more tangible good this way than all the duels and palaces combined, but those acts rarely make the history book. Her personal interests leaned conservative, rooted in tradition. She was deeply Catholic, and faith offered her something her marriages had not: structure, ritual, a way to frame the absurdities of her life within a narrative of endurance. While Paris gossiped about scandals, Anna spent time funding churches and supporting religious institutions. There's a poignancy in the heiress who had once been pulled across an ocean to play the game of European nobility ended her days finding stability not in palaces but in prayer. She lived into long years, passing away in 1961, a lifetime that had begun in the Gilded Age of New York and ended in a century transformed by world wars, radio, airplane, and atomic bombs. She had seen her family's world of unimaginable wealth both collapse and reinvent itself. And through it all, she remained a strange figure, never beloved like her sister Consuelo, never infamous like her ex-husband Boni, but persistent, present, impossible to erase. What's striking is how the story of Anna Gould reminds us of a broader truth about heiresses and the fortunes they carry. Society loved to devour their scandals, to turn their marriages into spectacles, their dowries into punchlines, but rarely did it stop to consider them as people, as women trying to make lives in a world where their every choice was turned into content for others. Anna became an object lesson, not in romance, not in glamour, but in endurance. And maybe that's why she still matters, because when the jewels were forgotten, when the palace fell out of style, when Boni's name faded into the absurd footnotes of history, Anna was still there. She had children, she had causes, she had faith, and she had the final word that so many heiresses never got: longevity. So when you think of the Gilded Age heiresses who crossed oceans to buy title, remember this: not all of them burned out in scandal or disappeared into tragic headlines. Some, like Anna, simply outlived the chaos, and there's a quiet kind of power in. After decades of being the American outsider in Paris, Anna's later life grew increasingly quiet. By the 1930s and 1940s, she had retreated from the front-page scandals that had once defined her. Her fortune had been carved up by costly divorces, court cases, and the extravagant lifestyles of both Boni de Castellane and Élie de Talleyrand Périgord. But she was never truly poor. Gould poor meant perhaps one palace instead of. She remained respected in certain Paris circles, particularly within the orbit of her second husband's illustrious Talleyrand family, which carried the prestige of Napoleon's brilliant but notoriously slippery foreign minister. Anna had children with Élie de Talleyrand Périgord, including a son, Howard, who carried forward the ducal title. Through them, she secured a permanent link into the French aristocracy, though her American critics never let her forget that she had bought her way in, rather than been born to it. In her later years, Anna showed little appetite for publicity. Unlike some Gilded Age heiresses who tried to reinvent themselves as philanthropists or patrons of the arts, Anna kept a lower profile. She did make charitable contributions, particularly during the World Wars, when the wealthy were expected to contribute to relief efforts, but she never became a grand society benefactor in the mold of, say, Isabella Stewart Gardner. In fact, her reputation never really escaped the cloud of her scandalous early years. Society papers tended to mention her name with a sly tone, reminding readers of duels and divorces rather than dignified dinners. Still, she endured. She lived long enough to see the world change entirely, from the horse-drawn carriages of her Paris debut to the jet age of the 1960s. By the time of her death in Paris, on November 30th, 1961, the scandals of the Belle Époque were half a century behind her, remembered mostly as anecdotes in society history, and then her final return. Despite spending most of her life in France, Anna was ultimately brought home to America in death. She was laid to rest in the Grand Gould Mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx alongside her father, Jay Gould, the ruthless railroad baron who had set her on the path toward a title in the first place. The mausoleum itself was one of the largest and most imposing in the cemetery, a stone reminder that for all the ridicule she faced in Europe, in America, her family still symbolized raw, unassailable wealth. It's almost poetic. Anna Gould, who spent her life trying to escape being just a Gould in the eyes of American society, ended it by returning to the Gould name, in marble, in New York soil, in the kind of permanence no Paris scandal sheet could erase. So this was the story of Anna Gould, the heiress who thought she was marrying romance, but instead found herself financing vanity, dueling scandals, and dynastic games that would follow her name long after the carriages stopped rolling down the boulevards of Paris. What do you do when you are born with so much money that you can never really escape it? Anna tried. She crossed the Atlantic. She married into title. She financed palaces that looked more like stage sets than homes. She endured humiliation in the newspaper, betrayal in her marriage, and the strange, cold validation of finally being addressed as a duchess, not because of who she was, but because of what she could afford. And yet, she lived longer than anyone might have expected, through wars, revolutions of style and politics, depressions, and scandals that would have broken women of lesser means. She lived to see her children grown, to sit in palatial rooms long after the chandeliers had dimmed, to become a kind of relic herself, the last heiress of the Gilded Age, still alive when John F. Kennedy was president. There's something haunting in that image, isn't there? An old woman in Paris in the 1950s, remembered by almost no one, who once, in her youth, had been the scandal of Europe, someone who had carried the Gould fortune across an ocean, only to discover that even oceans could not drown the loneliness of being judged for what you represent instead of who you are. In her end, she returned home, back to New York, back to her father's mausoleum, back to the place where it all began, not as the Countess of Castellane, not as the Duchess of Talleyrand, but as Anna Gould, daughter of Jay Gould, and nothing more, nothing less. Her life is a reminder that money can open doors, yes, but sometimes those doors lead only to rooms filled with mirrors, and what you find reflected there is not always what you hoped for. And perhaps that's why her story still lingers, because in Anna Gould, we see both the fantasy and the curse of wealth, the glitter of Paris palaces, and the emptiness that echoed inside them. And maybe, just maybe, as you drift into sleep tonight, you'll carry with you not just the drama of her duels and divorces, but the quiet truth that even the richest among us are still only human, vulnerable, searching, hoping to be seen not just for what they have, but for who they are. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. So let this story carry you, and if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. Script written by Clara Finch, because women's stories always deserve a soul.